Have you ever felt like your life could change in an instant? Camille Johnson, a brilliant and fearless attorney, never imagined that a peaceful afternoon at the park would become the start of her fight for justice. Not just for herself, but for an entire community. If you believe in standing up for justice and creating real change, stick around until the end of this story. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more powerful and inspiring stories like this one. Together, we can be the voice of change. The golden rays of the afternoon sun filtered gently through the tall oak trees, casting dancing shadows on the soft, grassy ground. Laughter rang out across the park as children played tag, their squeals of joy blending harmoniously with the rustling leaves and the rhythmic footsteps of joggers. Families gathered under the shade, their voices warm with conversation and bursts of laughter. In the midst of this lively yet serene scene, Camille Johnson sat quietly on a wooden bench near the pond. She cradled a thick hardcover book in her hands, her fingers lightly tracing its edges as she read. For someone who spent her days navigating high-pressure courtrooms, this moment of peace felt like a rare gift, a chance to breathe, to escape the weight of her responsibilities, even if just for a little while. Her expression was calm, her focus unwavering as she flipped a page. To an onlooker, she seemed perfectly at ease. But Camille was no stranger to the subtle tension that often lingered in the air, an invisible thread connecting her every move to the assumptions of others. Yet today, she had chosen to let it all go, to immerse herself fully in the comfort of her book and the serenity of the park. The breeze picked up slightly, rustling her curls as she adjusted her seat, the corners of her lips curling into a soft, peaceful smile. It was a moment that felt like the world had paused, a moment untouched by chaos, judgment, or conflict. But life, Camille would soon realize, has a way of shattering even the most perfect stillness. The tranquility of the park shattered in an instant. A sharp screech pierced the air as a police cruiser pulled to an abrupt stop by the curb, its flashing lights cutting through the peaceful atmosphere like a warning. Heads turned, the carefree chatter of families and joggers fading into an uneasy silence. Two officers stepped out, their movements deliberate and calculated. The taller of the two scanned the park, his sharp gaze darting past laughing children and picnicking families, before locking onto Camille, the only black woman sitting alone on a bench. "Ma'am," the first officer called out, his tone sharp, laced with authority, "we need to talk to you for a moment." Camille glanced up from her book, her calm eyes meeting his. For a moment she hesitated, searching his expression for an explanation, but all she saw was suspicion. Closing her book gently, she straightened her posture and replied evenly, "Sure. What's this about?" The second officer stepped closer, his posture rigid, his tone clipped. "We got a call about suspicious activity in the area," he said, his words hanging in the air like an accusation. "Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Camille's brow furrowed slightly. "Suspicious activity?" she repeated, her voice calm but tinged with disbelief. "I'm just sitting here, reading my book." She held it up as if to make her point undeniable. But their scrutiny didn't waver. The taller officer's hand drifted toward his belt, a subtle but deliberate gesture. "Can we see some ID?" Her heartbeat quickened, but she forced herself to remain composed. "I don't understand," she said, meeting his gaze firmly. "What's the reason for this?" "It's routine," the second officer snapped, though his tone made it clear this was anything but. The murmurs of onlookers began to ripple through the park. Some glanced at Camille with curiosity, while others exchanged uneasy looks, sensing the imbalance in the interaction. Camille inhaled deeply, willing herself to stay calm. She reached into her bag, carefully pulled out her ID, and handed it over. The officer studied the card with unnecessary intensity, his lips curling slightly as he read aloud, "Camille Johnson." "And what's your business here, Miss Johnson?" "I live in this city," Camille replied, her voice steady despite the growing tension. "I came here to enjoy the park. Is that a problem?" The officer's jaw tightened. "We'll see," he muttered, handing back her ID. But instead of leaving, they lingered, their questions growing sharper, more invasive. "Do you always carry a book like that around?" one officer sneered. "Are you waiting for someone? Or just hanging out alone?" the other added, his tone almost mocking. Camille clenched her jaw, her patience wearing thin. She had spent years handling tense situations in courtrooms, but this was different. The imbalance of power, the weight of their judgment, it was suffocating. Taking a deep breath, she spoke firmly. "I'm not answering any more questions unless you tell me what I'm being accused of." The first officer's expression darkened. "Don't get smart with us," he barked, stepping closer. "We're just doing our job." "And I know the law," Camille countered, her voice unwavering. "I'm not breaking it by sitting in a public park." Without warning, the officer grabbed her arm. "You're resisting," he said, his voice rising. "What are you doing?" Camille exclaimed, her voice breaking with disbelief. "Stop resisting," the officer shouted louder, as if performing for the crowd that had now gathered. The cold metal of handcuffs snapped around her wrists, biting into her skin. Camille turned toward the onlookers, her eyes locking with a young woman holding up her phone, recording every second. Their silent exchange was brief but powerful. "Don't let this go unseen." As the officers led her to the cruiser, murmurs of outrage spread through the crowd. One voice rose above the rest. What did she even do? But no answers came. The car door slammed shut, sealing Camille away from the growing protest outside. She stared out the window, her reflection merging with the scene of a community slowly waking up to the injustice before them. This wasn't just an arrest. It was a battle cry. Camille took a steady breath, her voice calm and measured. "I've told you, I'm just here reading. This is a public park, and I have every right to be here." Her eyes met theirs, searching for a glimmer of understanding, but all she found was suspicion, cold and unyielding. The first officer stepped closer, his hand brushing against his belt. "We're not asking again," he said, his words sharp and cutting. Camille tightened her grip on her book, willing herself to stay composed. "If I've done something wrong, I'd like to know what it is," she replied, her tone firm but respectful. The taller officer's jaw tightened. His patience was wearing thin. "What's your problem?" he snapped. "We're just doing our job." "And I'm following the law," Camille countered. "But you haven't told me why you're questioning me." A flicker of irritation crossed his face, and the second officer took a step forward. His voice was louder now, almost rehearsed. "You're resisting." Camille blinked, her composure wavering. "What?" she asked, her voice rising in disbelief. "I haven't done anything." "Stop resisting," the officer barked, his tone rising as if to drown out her words. Before she could respond, his hand clamped down on her arm. Startled, Camille instinctively pulled back. "What are you doing?" she exclaimed, her voice breaking with shock. The second officer moved in swiftly, snapping the cold metal handcuffs around her wrists. The sound of the cuffs locking into place was deafening, drowning out even the murmurs of the crowd that had gathered. "She's not resisting," a voice called out from the group. "What's wrong with you?" someone else shouted, their words charged with anger. The tension in the air thickened as the murmurs turned into protests. A woman held up her phone, recording every moment, her lips pressed into a firm line. Camille saw her, and in that fleeting moment their eyes met. Camille's gaze carried a silent plea. "Don't let this be forgotten." The first officer tightened his grip on Camille's arm as they led her toward the cruiser. She stumbled slightly, her steps faltering under the weight of humiliation and disbelief. The faces of the onlookers blurred, but their voices rang clear. "This isn't right!" "She didn't do anything." Camille's chest tightened, but she refused to bow her head. She straightened her back, forcing herself to walk with dignity even as the handcuffs bit into her skin. The car door slammed shut, sealing her inside. Through the window she saw the crowd, strangers standing together, their voices rising in outrage. Inside the cruiser, the silence was suffocating, pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't shake. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass, her expression stoic but her mind racing. Anger simmered beneath her calm exterior. She clenched her fists, her determination hardening with each passing second. This wasn't just about her. It couldn't be. This was the start of something much bigger. At first, the park carried on as usual. A jogger slowed her pace, glancing over her shoulder at the scene unfolding, but kept moving. A family picnicking under a tree exchanged confused looks, unsure if they should intervene. For most, the sharp voices of the officers were just another noise in the background. But then, as the tension escalated, the atmosphere began to shift. Camille's voice cut through the air as she tried to explain herself, her calm composure giving way to disbelief. The officer's tone grew sharper, their movements more aggressive. One by one, heads turned, curiosity morphing into unease. "What's happening?" someone whispered. A man standing nearby furrowed his brow, his arms crossed tightly. "What did she do?" he muttered, the question hanging heavy in the air. As the officers snapped the cuffs onto Camille's wrists, a mother clutched her child's hand tighter. Her gaze shifted between Camille and the officers, anger simmering beneath her quiet concern. "This doesn't feel right," she murmured, almost to herself. Near the edge of the crowd, a young woman stood still, her phone raised. The faint glow of the recording screen lit her determined expression. She wasn't just a bystander. She was a witness. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the angle, her focus unshakable. Camille caught sight of her just as the officers began leading her toward the police cruiser. Their eyes met briefly. In that fleeting moment there was an exchange, a silent promise. "Don't let this disappear." The young woman gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, her grip on the phone tightening. Around her, the murmurs of the crowd grew louder, shifting from curiosity to frustration. A man's voice rose above the others, firm and clear. "She didn't do anything wrong. She was just sitting there," another shouted, his tone sharp with indignation. The tension in the air thickened, the unease rippling through the park like a rising tide. But the officers ignored the growing outrage, their eyes fixed ahead as they guided Camille into the cruiser. The car door slammed shut with a hollow thud, silencing the crowd for a moment. The young woman lowered her phone, her face a mixture of anger and determination. She stepped forward, her voice steady as she spoke to someone nearby. "I got everything. Every second of it." The voices around her began to overlap. Outrage, disbelief, questions of why and what happens now. The quiet unity of the park was gone, replaced by the stirring sound of a community beginning to wake up. Inside the cruiser, Camille stared out the window, her reflection merging with the faces of the strangers who had spoken up. The anger that churned inside her softened, replaced by something far more powerful: hope. The community had seen her. They hadn't turned away. And now, the world would see her too. The fluorescent light in the small holding cell buzzed faintly, casting a cold, unwelcoming glow over the bare gray walls. Camille sat on the metal bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The chill from the steel seeped into her skin, but the cold was the least of her concerns. Her wrists ached, raw from the handcuffs that had been snapped on so carelessly. She stared at the faint red marks, her chest tightening with a mix of anger and humiliation. The image of the park, the accusing voices, the cold click of the cuffs, the crowd's murmurs, played over and over in her mind. For a moment, she felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. The sting of being treated as though she were less than human was sharp and relentless. How did it come to this? She thought. Her eyes shifted to the room around her. The cold concrete walls felt like they were closing in, the silence interrupted only by the faint echo of distant footsteps. She felt small, invisible. But then, deep within that silence, another voice emerged, her own. It reminded her of the courtroom. Of the cases she had fought for, those who had no one else to stand up for them. She thought of the mother who had been denied justice for her son. The young man falsely accused who she had helped walk free. Camille had seen fear and desperation in their eyes, and every time she had fought like hell to make sure their voices were heard. She straightened her back, her breath steadying as she pushed the humiliation aside. "I've been here before," she reminded herself. "Not in this cell, but in the face of injustice, and I've never backed down." The marks on her wrists weren't just a reminder of the humiliation. They were a symbol of the fight that lay ahead, a fight she couldn't afford to lose. Her thoughts turned to the young woman in the park, phone in hand, recording everything, and to the crowd, their voices rising in outrage. They hadn't turned away, they had seen what happened, and they were waiting for her. Camille closed her eyes for a brief moment, drawing strength from the memory of their support. When she opened them, the fear and doubt were gone. In their place was something far more powerful: resolve. She sat up straighter, her fists clenched against the cold bench. The room felt less suffocating now, the light less harsh. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. That night, Camille sat at her kitchen table, The silence of her apartment broken only by the rustle of papers and the quiet hum of the lamp overhead. Legal pads, case files, and open books were spread out before her like the battlefield of a determined mind. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrote, not from fear, but from a simmering resolve that had been building since the moment the handcuffs locked around her wrists. Each word she jotted down was a step toward reclaiming her dignity and something much bigger. She replayed the events in her mind, her pen pausing as anger flickered behind her calm exterior. The officers' voices, their dismissive tone, the tight grip on her arm. They weren't just attacking her. They were attacking everything she stood for. "This isn't just about me," she murmured, the words echoing softly in the empty room. Camille leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes briefly as memories of past victories surfaced. She had fought battles for others before, stood up for people who thought they had no chance. Now it was her turn to fight, not just for herself, but for every voice that had been silenced. The video from the park played on her laptop screen, its rawness stark and undeniable. She had watched it once already, her chest tightening with every second. But now, as she hit replay, she didn't feel the same sting of humiliation. Instead, she saw it as evidence, a weapon she could wield to hold the system accountable. She reached for her phone, dialing a number she knew by heart. The voice on the other end belonged to Marissa, a trusted colleague and close friend. "Marissa," Camille began, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was about to say, "I need your help. I'm filing a civil rights lawsuit." Marissa didn't hesitate. "Tell me what you need," she replied, her tone as resolute as Camille's. Over the next few days, Camille began assembling her case. She combed through legal precedents, gathering every shred of evidence she could find to support her claims. Each document, each statute she cited, felt like a small victory, a step closer to justice. But it wasn't just her legal expertise driving the fight. The outpouring of support from the community fueled her determination. Messages flooded her inbox, strangers sharing their own stories of injustice, their voices echoing the same pain and frustration she had felt. "You're not alone," one email read. "What happened to you happens to so many of us. Fight for all of us." Those words stayed with her as she worked late into the night. She wasn't just building a lawsuit, she was building a movement. By the end of the week, Camille stood in her office, a stack of meticulously prepared documents in her hands. She felt the weight of them, not as a burden, but as a testament to her resolve. "This is just the beginning," she whispered to herself, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She knew the road ahead would be long and grueling. But Camille wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The video spread across social media like wildfire. It started with a single post, a simple caption that read, "This is what injustice looks like." Within hours, it was shared hundreds of times, each share carrying the raw truth of what had happened to Camille. The footage was unfiltered, unedited, and impossible to ignore. The video showed everything. Camille sitting peacefully on the park bench, the officer's approach, their sharp words, and finally, the click of the handcuffs. It ended with the murmurs of the crowd growing into protest. Each frame told a story of humiliation, injustice, and resilience. But the power of the video wasn't just in its views. It was in the voices it awakened. The comments poured in. "This could have been me. Why does this keep happening? She deserves justice." For every share, there was another story. A painful memory of injustice, a plea for change. People who had once felt silenced found themselves speaking up, adding their voices to the growing chorus. Camille's phone buzzed constantly. Strangers reached out, sharing their support, their outrage, and their own experiences. One message stood out. "I'm 64 years old, and I've spent my whole life hoping the system would change. Seeing you fight gives me hope that maybe it finally will." Her chest tightened as she read those words. The weight of their belief in her wasn't overwhelming, it was empowering. Days later, Camille stood on the courthouse steps, facing a sea of faces. The crowd was larger than she had imagined. People held signs that read, "Justice for Camille." Others carried messages that resonated even louder, "Justice for all." The air buzzed with energy. Some chanted her name, others called for accountability. But all of them were there for the same reason, to demand justice. Camille stepped forward, the microphone shaking slightly in her hand. She took a deep breath and began. "This fight isn't just mine," she said, her voice clear and steady. "It's ours. It's for every person who's ever been silenced, for everyone who's been told to sit down, stay quiet, and let it happen." Her eyes scanned the crowd. "We're here to say, no more." The applause erupted, deafening and unrelenting. Camille felt a wave of emotion surge through her. For the first time since the incident in the park, she didn't feel alone. She was part of something bigger now. A movement. A call for justice that couldn't be ignored. As the chants echoed around her, Camille stood taller, her resolve firm. She had started this fight as one voice. Now she carried the hopes of thousands, and she wasn't stopping until they were all heard. The email arrived late in the evening, just as Camille was reviewing notes for another case. She clicked it open, expecting another message of support or a routine update. But as she read the words, her breath caught. "You have been assigned as the presiding judge in the case of Carter and Daniels vs. Internal Affairs." Her mind froze for a moment. Carter and Daniels. The names were etched into her memory, tied to the humiliating day in the park when they had arrested her without cause. And now, she was to sit on the bench and decide their fate in a misconduct case, unrelated to her own experience. The irony was staggering. She stared at the screen, her thoughts swirling. It was a twist of fate she hadn't anticipated, a chance to wield justice over the very people who had tried to strip it away from her. But with that chance came a burden. Camille leaned back in her chair, her fingers pressing against her temples. She knew the rules of the courtroom, the weight of the gavel she would soon hold. As a judge, she was sworn to impartiality, to set aside personal feelings and let the facts guide her decisions. But how could she, when the faces of those officers were burned so deeply into her memory? The next morning, as she prepared for the hearing, her emotions were a mix of determination and unease. She couldn't deny the power of the moment. It was as though the universe had placed her here to show what justice truly looked like. When she stepped into the courtroom, the air was thick with tension. Reporters lingered outside, and whispers rippled through the gallery as she took her seat on the bench. Across the room, Carter and Daniels sat stiffly at the defendant's table. Their uniforms, once symbols of authority, now seemed more like armor against the reality they faced. As Camille adjusted her robe, she saw the recognition flash across their faces. Carter's jaw tightened, and Daniels shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between her and their attorney. For a moment, Camille allowed the silence to settle. She wanted them to feel the weight of the situation. Then she spoke, her voice calm but commanding. "This court is now in session." Her gaze swept the room, landing briefly on the officers. She saw their discomfort, the cracks in their confidence. But she also saw something else, a flicker of regret in Carter's eyes. Camille straightened her posture, her grip tightening slightly on the gavel. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about her personal pain. It was about justice. And justice, she reminded herself, demanded fairness, even when the burden felt impossibly heavy. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs, an undercurrent of tension that filled the air. Every seat was taken, and even the standing room at the back was crowded with people eager to witness the unfolding of this extraordinary case. Some held notebooks, ready to document every detail. Others sat silently, their eyes fixed on Camille. She stepped into the room, her black robe flowing behind her. The murmurs hushed instantly, replaced by a thick, expectant silence. Camille walked with purpose, her expression calm yet commanding, though she could feel the weight of every gaze pressing down on her. Her eyes swept over the room briefly. Faces of reporters, community leaders, and ordinary citizens reflected a mixture of curiosity and anticipation. She knew they weren't just here for a verdict. They were here to see if justice could prevail. At the defense table sat Carter and Daniels. Initially, they had entered the courtroom with confidence, their postures straight, their uniforms meticulously pressed. But as soon as Camille appeared, their composure began to crack. Carter's jaw tightened. He leaned toward Daniels, whispering something that didn't quite mask the unease in his expression. Daniels shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hand fidgeting with the edge of a file. When Camille took her seat at the bench, she felt their eyes on her, searching, questioning, perhaps even pleading. But she didn't meet their gaze. Instead, she adjusted her papers and spoke, her voice firm and steady. This court is now in session. The tension in the room seemed to grow heavier with those words. Camille's voice carried an authority that left no room for doubt. As the prosecutor began their opening statement, Camille listened intently, her pen moving across her notepad with deliberate strokes. Every so often, her gaze flickered to the defendants. She noted the way Carter's confidence ebbed as the evidence was presented. Daniels, who had initially sat with his arms crossed, now stared down at the table, avoiding the prosecutor's pointed words. The gallery remained silent, their focus unbroken. The gravity of the moment was palpable. This wasn't just about Carter and Daniels. It was about a system that too often allowed power to go unchecked. Throughout the proceedings, Camille maintained her professionalism, her expression neutral yet engaged. But inside, she could feel the storm of emotions she had carefully restrained. The faces of Carter and Daniels brought back flashes of that day in the park. The humiliation, the handcuffs, the disbelief in their eyes as she had dared to stand up for herself. Now, those same eyes were filled with uncertainty. As the prosecutor laid out the case, Camille felt the room lean in, the gallery hanging on to every word. Testimonies, video evidence, and reports painted a clear picture of misconduct. Still, Camille reminded herself, this isn't about revenge. She gripped the edge of the bench, her fingers brushing against the smooth wood. This is about the truth. When the defense took the floor, they spoke with practiced professionalism, attempting to justify the officer's actions. But their words lacked the weight to counter the evidence. Camille watched the jury, their faces reflecting skepticism as the defense's arguments faltered. By the time the day's proceedings came to a close, the courtroom was heavy with exhaustion but also anticipation. Camille struck her gavel with finality. "We will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m., she announced. As people began filing out, Camille lingered at the bench, organizing her notes. She could feel Carter and Daniels hesitating near the exit, their presence heavy in the room. But they said nothing. Eventually they left, their footsteps echoing down the corridor. Camille exhaled deeply, her resolve firm. She knew the hardest part was yet to come. Camille sat alone in her chambers, the quiet hum of the courthouse muffled behind the heavy oak door. The case file lay open on her desk, pages meticulously marked with notes from the day's proceedings. Yet her pen rested motionless in her hand. Her mind wasn't on the evidence. It was on them. Carter and Daniels. The men who had arrested her in that park. Their faces, their voices, the cold click of the handcuffs, they had been burned into her memory. Now those same men sat before her in court, waiting for her to decide their fate. Camille leaned back in her chair, exhaling deeply. She had always believed in the law, in the principles of justice and fairness. But now, as the weight of this case pressed down on her, she couldn't deny the truth gnawing at the edges of her resolve. Can I truly be impartial? Her heart and her mind waged a quiet war. She remembered the humiliation of that day, the sting of being treated as less than human. Her anger simmered beneath the surface, a constant reminder of the injustice she had endured. But she also remembered why she had chosen to become a judge in the first place. It wasn't to serve her own interests or seek revenge. It was to uphold the law, to ensure fairness, even when it felt impossible. Camille rubbed her temples, her thoughts spiraling. If I let my emotions cloud my judgment, what makes me different from them? She glanced at the gavel resting on her desk. Its weight had never felt heavier. It was a symbol of her authority, but also of her responsibility. She had promised to serve justice, not her version of it, but justice rooted in truth. Her gaze shifted to the framed photo on her desk, a picture of her and her late mentor. His words echoed in her mind, a guiding principle she had carried throughout her career. Justice isn't about who you are. It's about what's right. The memory steadied her. Camille straightened in her chair, her hands resting firmly on the desk. She knew this case wasn't just about Carter and Daniels. It was about proving that justice could rise above personal pain, that the system could work if approached with integrity. When the time came to return to the courtroom, Camille stood tall. Her emotions hadn't disappeared. They never would. But she had chosen to channel them into something greater. This isn't about them, she reminded herself as she gripped the door handle. It's about showing the world what justice should look like. With that, she stepped into the courtroom. her resolve unshaken. The courtroom was silent as Officer Carter took the stand. His uniform seemed to weigh heavier on his shoulders now, the polished brass badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights like a sharp reminder of his authority and the responsibility that came with it. He shifted in his seat, his hands gripping the edges of the witness stand. His attorney stood beside him, speaking with a practiced calm. "Officer Carter, can you explain your actions that day?" Carter cleared his throat. "We were responding to a call about suspicious activity in the park," he began, his voice steady but lacking conviction. "When we arrived, we identified Miss Johnson as a potential suspect. We followed standard procedures to question her." In the gallery, a murmur rippled through the crowd. Camille's gaze didn't waver. "And when she refused to cooperate?" the attorney prompted. Carter hesitated, his eyes flickering toward Camille. "She became difficult," he said carefully. "We believed she was resisting, so we had to act quickly to maintain control of the situation." The prosecutor stood, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she approached the stand. "Maintain control?" she echoed, her tone firm but measured. "Let's examine what that control looked like." She gestured toward the screen at the front of the courtroom. The video from the park began to play, the raw footage filling the room with its undeniable truth. It showed Camille sitting on the bench, the officers approaching with sharp, demanding tones. It captured their escalating aggression, the unnecessary force, and finally, the click of the handcuffs. The murmurs from the crowd that day seemed to echo now in the courtroom, a haunting reminder of the injustice. When the video ended, the prosecutor turned back to Carter. "At what point in this video, Officer Carter, does Miss Johnson appear to be resisting?" Carter opened his mouth, but no words came. "Was it when she showed you her ID?" the prosecutor continued. "Or when she calmly asked for an explanation? Or perhaps it was when she sat still while you placed handcuffs on her?" Carter's jaw tightened, his silence speaking louder than any defense he could muster. The prosecutor turned to the jury. "This is not about maintaining control," she said, her voice rising with conviction. "This is about abusing power. It's about targeting someone based on assumptions rather than facts, and it's about holding those actions accountable." The tension in the room was palpable. Next, the prosecutor called a witness to the stand, a woman who had been in the park that day. She described what she had seen, the officer's aggressive demeanor, the unjustified interrogation, and the way Camille had been treated despite her composure. Tears welled up in the woman's eyes as she spoke. "She didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice trembling. "She was just sitting there, reading. But they treated her like a criminal." The defense attorney attempted to counter, questioning the witness's perspective and intent. But the evidence was too clear, the testimonies too consistent. When Officer Daniels took the stand, the pattern repeated. His justifications faltered under the weight of the video, the witness accounts, and the prosecutor's unwavering questions. By the end of the day, the gallery was heavy with emotion. Camille struck her gavel, her voice steady as she announced the recess. "We will continue tomorrow at 9 a.m., she said. As the room emptied, Camille remained at the bench, her fingers resting lightly on the wood. The weight of the case pressed against her, but so did the resolve that had carried her this far. This wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning. The courtroom was silent, the air heavy with anticipation. Camille sat at the bench, her hands resting lightly on the gavel. She looked out at the faces before her, the jury, the defendants, the gallery filled with onlookers. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. She glanced at Carter and Daniels, their faces drawn with tension. They had come into this courtroom cloaked in authority, but now they sat exposed, their actions laid bare. Camille took a steady breath. Her voice, clear and firm, broke the silence. "In reviewing the evidence and testimony presented," she began, "this court finds that Officers Carter and Daniels failed to uphold the principles of their duty as law enforcement officers. Their actions demonstrated a misuse of power, and their conduct undermined public trust in the very institution they are sworn to serve." The gallery remained motionless, every word hanging in the air like a weight. This court believes that justice is not only about punishment, it is about accountability and reform. Camille's gaze swept the room, her tone resolute. "Therefore, Officers Carter and Daniels will face formal disciplinary action. Their records will reflect this misconduct, and they will be required to participate in mandatory retraining programs focused on de-escalation, implicit bias, and community engagement. Her voice softened slightly, but her words carried no less weight. The goal here is not just to punish, but to ensure that what happened in that park never happens again. True justice is rooted in change. She raised the gavel, pausing briefly. This court is adjourned. The sharp crack of the gavel echoed through the room, signaling the end of the trial, but the beginning of something far more significant. As the courtroom began to empty, the sound of shuffling feet and hushed conversations filled the air. Camille remained seated at the bench, her hands resting gently on the polished wood. The weight of the trial still lingered, but the gavel's echo had brought a sense of closure. She glanced briefly at the gallery, where community members exchanged quiet smiles and hopeful nods. This wasn't just her victory. It belonged to everyone who had stood against injustice. From the corner of her eye, Camille noticed Carter approaching. His steps were hesitant, his gaze fixed downward as he neared the bench. Daniels lingered by the doorway, his posture stiff, unwilling to follow. Carter stopped a few feet away, the weight of the moment evident in his hunched shoulders and clenched fists. For a long second, neither of them spoke. Finally, he looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "Your Honor," he began, his voice low and unsteady. I just want to say I'm sorry. For everything." The words hung in the air, raw and unexpected. Camille's expression didn't waver. She held his gaze, her face calm and composed. But in her eyes, there was something more. Something that Carter seemed to recognize. It wasn't anger. It wasn't resentment. It was understanding. Camille didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was eloquent, her steady gaze carrying a message that words couldn't convey. "This is your chance to change. Don't waste it." Carter nodded slightly, as if he had heard her unspoken message. He took a step back, his shoulders still heavy but his expression softer, almost contemplative. As he turned and walked toward the door, Camille exhaled quietly. The room seemed lighter now, the tension easing like a storm passing. This wasn't about forgiveness. It was about hope. Hope that even those who had faltered could learn, grow, and make amends. Camille's gaze shifted to the doorway as Carter exited, his figure disappearing into the hallway. For a brief moment, she closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel the gravity of what had just happened. Then she stood, her resolve as strong as ever. The work wasn't over, but this moment, a flicker of light in a long, dark fight, gave her the strength to continue. Outside the courthouse, the air was alive with energy. A diverse crowd had gathered, their voices blending into a symphony of hope and determination. Some carried signs reading "Justice for All," while others stood in quiet solidarity. Camille stepped out into the sunlight, her black robe flowing lightly in the breeze. She paused at the top of the courthouse steps, scanning the crowd. For a moment, she felt the enormity of the moment, not as a burden, but as a responsibility she was ready to embrace. A few steps away, community leaders stood in a small circle, engaged in animated discussion with local police officers. Camille walked toward them, her steps deliberate yet approachable. The conversations quieted as she joined the group, all eyes turning to her. "Your Honor," one of the leaders, an older woman with kind but determined eyes, said, "Thank you for standing with us." Camille shook her head gently. "It's not about standing with or apart," she replied. "It's about standing together. Justice doesn't belong to one group. It belongs to all of us." Her words resonated, sparking a renewed dialogue. Policymakers discussed actionable reforms with activists. Officers listened as community members shared their stories of pain and mistrust. And through it all, Camille stood as a bridge, ensuring every voice was heard. Nearby, a group of children played on the courthouse lawn, their laughter a striking contrast to the seriousness of the conversations. A boy held a brightly colored sign that read, "Justice for All." Another girl carefully adjusted her own, the words written in shaky, youthful handwriting. "Equality starts here." Camille smiled, drawn toward the group of children. She crouched down to their level, her eyes meeting theirs with warmth. "Do you know what justice means?" she asked gently. One of the older kids nodded, holding his sign higher. "It means everyone gets treated fair," he said proudly. Camille's smile widened. "That's exactly right. she said, "and it's up to all of us to make sure that happens." The children gathered closer, their voices chiming in with questions and ideas. Camille listened patiently, her presence a symbol of the future they deserved, a future rooted in understanding and equity. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Camille stood with the children and their signs, her hands resting lightly on their shoulders. The crowd around them watched, a collective sense of unity settling over the scene. Photographers snapped pictures, capturing the moment. Camille surrounded by children holding signs of hope, standing as a beacon of justice and progress. This wasn't just an ending, it was a beginning. This story isn't just about one woman, it's about all of us. It's about every person who has ever felt silenced, dismissed, or unseen. It's about the communities that have carried the weight of injustice for far too long. And it's about the power we hold when we come together to demand change. Justice is not a solitary fight. It is a collective effort built on the voices of many and the courage to stand up for what's right. Today, we saw that change is possible, but this moment is only the beginning. If you believe in the power of fairness, if you believe that justice should serve everyone equally, then let this story be a reminder that standing together is our greatest strength. Share this story. Talk about it. Let it inspire conversations, actions, and movements in your own community, because justice can only truly be achieved when we all fight for it. The fight for justice doesn't end here. It continues with you. Thank you for watching and being part of this journey. If this story moved you, please give it a like, share it with others who need to hear it, and hit the subscribe button to join us for more meaningful stories. Your support fuels our passion and helps us create even more impactful content. Together we can inspire change, one story at a time. Let's keep the conversation alive. Justice starts with all of us. Thank you for believing in the power of fairness and hope.